Today is May 19th, 2026, and President Trump just posted the most operationally consequential statement of this entire conflict. Not the Truth Social post with the American flag and the map of Iran with arrows converging from every direction in the Middle East, though that was a statement in its own right. Not the post where he said the clock is ticking and there won't be anything left of them. Not the post where he described the Iranian regime screaming all the time while sending proposals with nothing to do with what was agreed. The statement that matters most, the one that moved oil markets, put every diplomat on Earth on emergency phone calls, and forced the IRGC leadership to perform its version of strategic recalculation inside whatever bunker it is currently occupying, is this one. At my direction, United States forces had a military operation scheduled for tomorrow. Following a request from the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of the United Arab Emirates, I have decided to hold off the planned attack.
Serious negotiations are now taking place, and in their opinion, a deal will be made that is very acceptable to the United States and all countries in the Middle East and beyond. This deal will include, importantly, no nuclear weapons for Iran. Based on my respect for these leaders, I have instructed the Secretary of War, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, and the United States military that we will not be doing the scheduled attack of Iran tomorrow, but have further instructed them to be prepared to go forward with a full large-scale assault of Iran on a moment's notice in the event that an acceptable deal is not reached. Read every sentence of that statement with the analytical weight it carries, because this is not just a diplomatic announcement. This is the most sophisticated piece of strategic communication in the entire conflict, and it changes everything about the next 48 to 72 hours in ways that the surface reading of the statement does not fully capture.
But let's back all the way up, because to understand why Trump's announcement that a planned attack has been postponed at the request of 3 Gulf Arab leaders is not a softening of the American position, but a hardening of it through a completely different mechanism. Why the explosions currently occurring in southern Tehran at sensitive sites that Iranian state media has stopped trying to explain. Why an IRGC naval vessel has sunk in the Persian Gulf near Kharg Island. Why 20 Iranian oil tankers are sitting motionless outside Kharg Island because the storage tanks are literally full and oil is spilling into the Persian Gulf. And why the IRGC's response to all of this has been to create a Persian Gulf Strait Authority X account, train pro-regime civilian women on AK-47s on national television, and hold mass weddings for 1,000 IRGC couples simultaneously. You need to understand the specific strategic architecture of Trump's statement and why calling the 3 Arab Gulf leaders into the statement rather than Pakistan is the most consequential diplomatic repositioning of the entire conflict's back-channel structure. Here is the complete picture of what has happened in the last 48 hours and why every element of it is pointing toward the same operational endpoint. In the southern parts of Tehran, there have been explosions at sensitive sites, multiple explosions. Iranian state media, which previously responded to similar explosions with the gas leak explanation, then the unexploded American bomb explanation when the gas leak narrative collapsed under the weight of its own absurdity given the frequency and geographic distribution of the events, has now stopped providing any explanation whatsoever. The cessation of the explanation is the most revealing signal. When an authoritarian regime state media stops explaining events that are visible to its own population, it is because the explanation options have been exhausted. The gas leak narrative required the Iranian public to believe that their country's gas infrastructure was failing simultaneously across multiple cities in a pattern that consistently targeted sensitive military and security sites rather than residential neighborhoods or commercial districts. That narrative collapsed. The unexploded American bomb narrative required the Iranian public to believe that American precision weapons, whose precision was the stated basis for the ceasefire's legitimacy as a military pause rather than an American defeat, were actually imprecise enough to leave large quantities of unexploded ordnance distributed across the country. That narrative collapsed under the weight of its internal contradiction. When you stop explaining something, it is because every explanation you can provide makes the situation worse than the explanation's absence. The explosions are happening. They are happening at sensitive sites. The state media is silent. Draw your own conclusions. Now, let's get into the IRGC ship sinking near Kharg Island, because this event in the western part of the Hormuz area tells you something specific about the ongoing enforcement activity that the ceasefire label has not paused.
and that the IRGC's propaganda apparatus has been unable to narrativize as anything other than what it is. An Iranian vessel that had previously been hit in an American engagement has now fully sunk in the Persian Gulf. The vessel was already damaged from a prior strike. It had been attempting to operate or simply survive in place despite that damage. It could not. It is now at the bottom of the Persian Gulf, adding its own contribution to the oil contamination that is spreading across the Gulf from the multiple sources that the blockade's enforcement actions and the storage crisis at Kharg Island are producing simultaneously. The oil contamination itself is a strategic indicator of an operational significance that extends beyond its environmental consequences. 20 Iranian oil tankers are currently sitting motionless in the waters off Kharg Island, with maximum oil contamination visible in satellite imagery around them. 20 tankers motionless because the storage tanks at Kharg Island have reached maximum capacity. The oil that Iran is extracting from its fields has nowhere to go. The tankers are full, the storage tanks are full. The production that continues because stopping it risks reservoir damage is producing oil that is literally spilling into the Persian Gulf because no storage remains, and no tanker can be loaded because no tanker can deliver, because the blockade has closed every maritime export route. This is the physics clock's terminal phase visible from orbit. The oil spill is not a military action. It is the physical overflow of an economic system that has been sealed at its export end and is now exceeding its storage capacity at every point along the chain from wellhead to terminal. Now let's talk about Trump's planned attack tomorrow statement in the full analytical depth it requires, because this statement is simultaneously the most direct military threat Trump has made in this conflict and the most sophisticated diplomatic maneuver he has executed since the Beijing summit. The statement announces that the United States had a military operation scheduled for tomorrow. Let's be precise about what that means and what it does not mean. Arab Gulf leaders, the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the President of the UAE. Read who is not in that list. Pakistan, the country that was the primary mediating party throughout the ceasefire period. The country that housed the Islamabad talks. The country whose field marshal and Prime Minister Trump described as the motivation for agreeing to the ceasefire in the first place. Pakistan is absent from the postponement statement. The Gulf Arabs are present. That substitution is the most consequential diplomatic repositioning of the ceasefire period. It removes the mediating role from the party whose neutrality has been systematically compromised, specifically an Iranian Air Force intelligence aircraft parked 10 kilometers from Islamabad, and places it in the hands of the parties who are directly affected by the conflict's continuation and who have the most specific and credible leverage with both the Iranian civilian diplomatic faction and the IRGC command structure. Now, let's understand what Trump's statement does to the Gulf Arab leaders' relationship with the IRGC. Trump told the Emir of Qatar, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, and the President of the UAE that the United States was going to attack Iran. He then agreed to hold off specifically because they asked him to. The Gulf Arab leaders now own the postponement. If the IRGC does not produce an acceptable deal within the window that the postponement creates, the next American large-scale assault is understood by every party in the region as having been specifically enabled by the Gulf Arab leaders' personal request for a delay that the IRGC used to avoid rather than facilitate a deal. The consequences of that failure will fall on the Gulf Arab leaders' relationship with Washington in ways that create enormous pressure on those leaders to use every available lever over the IRGC to produce the deal that would justify their request for the delay. The Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia does not want to be the person who asked Trump to wait and then watch the IRGC squander the window. The Emir of Qatar does not want his personal credibility with the American president expended on a delay that produced nothing. The president of the UAE, whose country is still intercepting Iranian drones during the ceasefire, and whose Baraka nuclear plant's outer perimeter generator is still not repaired from Sunday's strike, has the most immediate and personal stake in the IRGC producing an acceptable deal rather than being bombed tomorrow instead of tonight. Trump has converted the Gulf Arab leaders from observers of the diplomatic process into active participants who have personally staked their credibility with Washington on the outcome of the window his statement created. That is not a softening of American pressure. That is the multiplication of pressure sources applied to the IRGC from a direction that the IRGC's internal calculus has not fully prepared for. Now, let's talk about Trump's other statement, the sarcastic one, about what would happen if Iran surrenders. He wrote that if the Islamic Republic admits their navy is gone and resting at the bottom of the sea, and their air force is no longer with them, and if their entire military walks out of Tehran with weapons dropped and hands held high, each shouting, "I surrender," while wildly waving the white flag, and if their entire remaining leadership signs all necessary documents of surrender, the failing New York Times and corrupt CNN will headline that Iran had a masterful and brilliant victory over the United States. Read what that post communicates to the Iranian population watching state media report victories that the observable world does not confirm. Trump is preemptively dismantling the face-saving narrative architecture that the IRGC needs to exist in order to authorize the civilian diplomatic faction to make nuclear concessions that the IRGC can describe to its domestic audience as something other than surrender. He is saying explicitly that whatever narrative the Iranian state media constructs around the terms of any deal, the American media will describe it as surrender anyway. The face-saving mechanism that the IRGC's domestic legitimacy requires is being removed by Trump publicly in advance of the deal, rather than after it. The question of whether this is deliberate pressure or genuine contempt for the Iranian regime's narrative management is less important than its operational effect. It tells the IRGC that the face-saving path out does not exist in the American media environment, Iran's institutional collapse, because the chain of command breakdown that the analytical community has been documenting is now producing visible behavioral symptoms that are more revealing than any official statement from any Iranian government official. The top of the Iranian power structure is in a state that can be described charitably as unclear and uncharitably as absent. The new supreme leader, reportedly Mojtaba Khamenei, has not been seen publicly in a format that allows independent verification of his condition or his act of governance. The previous supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, died and has reportedly not yet been formally buried, which in the context of the information management that the regime is conducting around the